and welcome to another episode of Red Talks.live, your home of ranting engineers and DevOps. This is our second episode of 2019, and I am delighted to have a new guest, a new colleague, the very well-known Kin Lane. Kin, say hi to the audience.
Hello there. Thanks for having me. My name's Kin Lane. I'm an API architect here at F5, so I'm excited to be here talking APIs with you.
Now, if anyone searches API evangelism, you're probably the first name that they're going to come up with. Tell us a little bit about your experience with APIs. You're kind of a big deal in this world. I'm a little bit starstruck here today. Tell us about what you've been doing for the last kind of 8 years.
Just quick backstory. So I'm an old DBA. I've been doing databases since the 80s. COBOL, FoxPro, Microsoft SQL Server. Around 2006, I was working at SAP, and there's this, I was doing a lot of web services, but I saw these new type of web APIs kind of emerging. They were kind of commerce driven, kind of social driven, Twitter, Facebook. And then 2006, 2007, I started using them to deploy global infrastructure with this new thing called the cloud. Some people might have heard about the cloud. It's a pretty cool thing. Yes, exactly. And, by 2010, I was like, I saw mobile phones, the iPhone came out, Android, and I saw that web APIs were being used to deliver resources to these newfangled devices that were in our pockets. And so 2010, I started studying it full time. I started a blog called API Evangelist, and 8 years later, I just kind of put a pause on it this month to come work at F5. Just kind of had run its course, but over 8 years, I focus on the tech of APIs, obviously, but really on the business of APIs, and then what I consider the politics of APIs, which is all of that cultural, how do we deal with our technical legacy debt, decomposing the monolith, all the things you hear about of why large enterprise organizations are wanting to do web APIs. And I work with, startups up to large enterprises, and I've done a lot of work with the U.S. federal government. I worked for the Obama administration doing web API inventory across federal agencies. And then in latest fall, I went over and helped the EU Commission on their API strategy for cross member states for the European Union as well. So just try to help groups understand why, and then get into the dirty details of how you start with this, start with web APIs. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today. So happy to be here.
I'm not sure how to follow that. I'm Nathan, and I tie my own laces on my shoes when I get out. Actually, I'm even wearing shoes with laces today. Like, that's how bad it is. That's a really cool background. And if anyone hasn't read your blog, API Evangelist, I think most of the content on there actually doesn't date and will not date. It's about kind of what it takes to become an API-centered world, an API-first world, and then the API politics. I love that term. That's a large part of it, and something you're really good at. So for anyone, don't think just because Ken said, his focus might have changed a little bit for now. Like, that content is gold and will continue to be. So I highly recommend people go take a look. Which that background though perfectly leads us on to kind of the topic I wanted to start with you, which is, what does it take? Like, we hear this word API first. What does that really mean? Like, tell us through that term.
Well, most organizations are doing APIs. API is kind of a broad term. That's why you hear me say web APIs pretty frequently, because I'm specifically talking about using the web as a transport to drive, as I said, mobile applications, but you can drive websites, you can drive other system-to-system integrations. But there's a lot of different types of APIs out there. And my goal is to help organizations understand how to use low-cost web infrastructure that really speaks to a wide developer audience. and be able to build any sort of applications and move data, content, and provide access to algorithms and increasingly devices and network devices, and just make them accessible to whoever needs it. And so to really get started, where I start with a lot of organizations, and I'm actually doing that with F5 right now because I'm in my second week here. But this is something I've done with many other enterprise groups is a discovery process, which is what's already built, what's out there, what APIs already exist, what existing schemas from databases exist. And I'm talking, I work with organizations that have databases going back to the 1960s. I mean, F5 isn't quite that long, but we go back to the 90s. But taking inventory of what are those existing digital assets across the enterprise, and then along with that is mapping out the teams who are building these APIs, who are sustaining a lot of these old web services and old databases and old applications and systems, and just really mapping that landscape. And then you start trying to figure out, well, what's the lowest hanging fruit here for turning into APIs, and take a few that show the potential of web APIs. And a lot of times I'll just take the existing schema, create API designs using Open API specification, and then I'll mock and I'll document those APIs and kind of pretend like they're real and show people what's possible without actually writing code, without costly quarterly sprints. Just get some APIs up and show what's possible. And then that can feed into an API design first process, where if we want to take existing systems and deliver them as APIs or entirely new greenfield APIs, you can just design them, you can mock them, you can document them, and you can share them with team members, whether it's backend teams or UI teams, and get feedback. Is this what you're looking for? Will this work? And iterate upon them without that costly and longer running, process of developing and writing code. So
that's really interesting. So there's multiple aspects of API first. There's API first like in attitude and in behavior and patterns, but then there's API first in actual development and strategy around how you architect solutions. So I've got my really lucky people who start a brand new company. It's very easy to go and do an API first strategy where I start out like, this is what my interface is going to look. I use brilliant tools like the Swagger.io website where I can actually craft it all up and then build a backend to support it. But then you've got organizations where, like you're seeing, I mean, F5's been growing for 20 years. I should know the answer to that, something like that. There's things that you've got to look at where the API technology people are using today did not exist when we invented that technology that's still really useful. So now I've got to think in the other direction of how I present that. And maybe that wasn't designed to work in the same asymmetrical ways or asynchronous ways that modern technologies expect it to. So how do you mash those two worlds? So I like to carve it into two different things. There's the technology perspective of API first, but then the business side. And I think that's what you're getting at before when you said the API politics. Did I get that right?
Yeah. I mean, really, most organizations, that's one thing that changed from 2010 to 2018, 19 for me was when I first started, I was like, API first, API. Everyone's like, wait, what? Who? Why? This doesn't really make sense. Now I really don't have to convince people. Most organizations have the will, at least at the executive leadership or with innovation teams, but really making sure that API first belief and vision is owned and shared across teams. And I go into, we have a lot of smart people at F5 who've been doing this a while, people working on the data and control plane, been, working with, hardware for a long time. They're way smarter than I am, but they're just not as familiar with some of the modern web concepts and why API, what's simple API, and for me, APIs are about taking these valuable digital resources and making them accessible to as wide as possible audience as you can, partners, developers, publicly. And these really smart folks down deep embedded in these teams aren't always thinking on those terms. And so really helping, evangelize across teams and help people understand, well, what do I mean when I say web API? What do I mean when I say API first? And then just, basic introduction to some of these concepts, and then starting conversations and trying to help people understand how it's going to actually make their worlds a little bit better, and then really make an impact on the business goals and objectives as well. But culturally, that's easier said than done. I mean, some of these people are very happy doing what they're doing. And so persuading folks and incentivizing folks to change is always a long haul. So
I get what you mean. I mean, it's not like we're day one with a group of 3 people working in a basement and we can make that decision of like, okay, everyone who adds a feature, you've got to consider in your testing how that's accessible via a programmable interface, versus a company where actually there are entire teams that are just very, very focused on intercepting packets and doing really clever and smart things with it. But the way they approach doing that is very different from the way you'd consider how to communicate with it. And I guess that's why we got an awesome person like you to kind of work on some of those things. And I think a large part is even both internally and externally educating people, because not only it's your work is going to be very much on kind of working with those people who aren't about the control systems and external facing, but also the people that have traditionally managed and deployed F5 technology have been network engineers. I may sit there on the CLI and on the GUI, and they're all being told by DevOps and site reliability engineers they'll sure not do it that way anymore. So we got a lot of messaging to do and communicating, I think, and well, I'm gonna do what I like to do, publicly get you commit to future episodes to help people understand this in this transition, Ken.
Yeah, I mean, education is so important to this, and just not just educating people about what APIs, but helping people feel like they have a voice. That they're not just being steamrolled over and their job is irrelevant. The old network engineer persona versus the new DevOps kind of cool kids. Trying to make sure everyone can kind of work together and speak the same vocabulary internally, but externally, and getting everyone on that same vocabulary and using the same words, and then designing API interfaces that can use those consistent terms across the UI, across the CLI, and then just really expedite the programmability. I would say first the exposure of all the capabilities that an enterprise has. F5 has just such a wide range of products and really granular level atomic features. So how do you create a whole dictionary, of that vocabulary, of those capabilities, and make them make sense? So trying to reduce acronyms or expand acronyms and make things speak to that new DevOps person who maybe doesn't get the full picture, but still giving that full picture to the old school network guys who just want to get down and actually just start hammering on this, and they know what they need. So building a vocabulary that speaks to that entire audience takes a lot of education, training, and just working with folks.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, F5's free online Super NetOps training, I mean, that had to happen first to just teach people that you can use an API to do things that you've been doing via a GUI and CLI. But what you're focusing on is, I mean, at the moment, we're just exposing all of the knobs and buttons, and we have all of the knobs and buttons, as you've discovered, walking through it. So rationalizing that in a way that is suitable to those two different audiences. And I agree with you, we're not replacing NetOps, we're applying principles and practices of developer worlds to NetOps. So it's a meeting in the middle. How can we make the best interface and rationalize that in a way that's going to keep both sides happy? So the more I talk about it, I think, wow, you've got like the impossible job, but that's why you're here.
Yeah, I like these impossibilities. I mean, the object model for F5, you first get in front of it and you're like, wow, I don't think I'm going to ever be able to understand this. And then it slowly comes into focus, and the more you work with it, So trying to create interfaces that speak to that vast amount of capabilities is really what I like doing, and trying to simplify it and trying to understand, you know, the complexity in here, but distill that down to something that's going to be meaningful, again, to the widest possible audience that I can. And that's my role as a communicator. But also for me, it's a big part of it is storytelling. And that's why I jumped, like when you propose this conversation, and hopefully we're going to do more of them, storytelling is super critical to this. And I always pitch my wife, she has her master's in folklore and storytelling. And so she really helped me kind of position the API Evangelist kind of brand and how I do what I do, because she's like, you know, really deeply studied how history occurs and gets told and retold. And so coming up with, you know, really good mythical tales around, you know, networking opportunities and what F5 is capable of, that's what I like doing. And so, but that requires talking to people who've been doing it, listening to their stories, distilling it down, and then bringing, you know, surfacing practical APIs that can help people achieve those goals, and whether they're technical or business or you know, any other objectives. That's what I like doing. So
that is a fascinating melding of your wife's experience to what you do. That's quite cool. I like that. I have great skin. My wife's a dermatologist. So
nice.
Sharing is caring, apparently.
Yeah.
So I think this has been a really good intro episode. We're not going to get like deep into any weeds today. I just wanted to kind of get you on the show, get out there what you're all about, and introduce that we're gonna keep having these conversations and pick sort of meatier topics to kind of tick off each time. So great to have your insight and your wisdom on here, Kin. Any other than obviously starting with your blog, where should people go and look for information and learn so that they can kind of follow along our conversations? Are there any great kind of resources, again, second to your blog, obviously, out there on the internet?
I mean, yeah, I mean, start with my blog, because the homepage of API Evangelist, and I apologize, it's kind of an 8-year mess. It's been a marathon for me, and I'm kind of clean it up and spend some time putting a search on it, and it's a massive amount of information, and there's a lot of links and references to other places. So I recommend starting there. But beyond that, you know, I recommend getting involved with the Open API initiative, which is it's started as Swagger, which is a way to describe APIs, but now it's a more mature organization that's part of the Linux Foundation, and it really spans all industries. So it's a way of describing APIs, you know, machine readable way, but across any industry and any application. So, you know, there's healthcare, there's education, there's government, city, federal, and then, you know, I'm going to be contributing a lot when it comes to the networking side of things. And so really get involved in the Open API, I would say, is a good place to start, because it, you know, no matter what business sector you come from, there's going to be a lot of information there for you to get access to. So
that's fantastic advice. And even if you don't have a product that you're building or a service that you're presenting, go and create a mock API. Like, I love their interface. You can actually mock up responses and build your policy and structure it all out and really get to know what it takes to deliver a web API service. So that's great advice. And they've got excellent data. I've watched some of their videos with tutorials. There's a great API first tutorial, in fact, to watch. So excellent tip for beginners. Thanks for that, Ken.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, that's the end of episode 1 with Ken Lane at F5. Say goodbye, Ken. Thanks for listening.
All right. Yeah, I appreciate you having me, Nathan. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. You've been listening to RedTalks.live, your home of ranting engineers and DevOps. I've been your host, Nathan Pierce. That was Ken Lane, and thanks for listening.